The first big reform test for you was the float of the dollar.
Yeah.
The big landmark moment starting your whole financial reform agenda.
Yeah.
30 years later, the float probably doesn't sound all that big a deal, terribly dramatic to those who weren't there for it. But briefly, why was it necessary to float the dollar?
It was necessary because the Australian economy was locked up and uncompetitive, and the dollar was too high in value. So it was killing miners, farmers particularly. So the international, forget the tariff supported industries, the internationally competitive ones, the ones that dug up copper, lead and zinc, coal and iron ore, were barely competitive because wages were too high and the exchange rate was too high. So firstly, it was too rigid. Secondly, you couldn't run a monetary policy with a fixed exchange rate. With a fixed exchange rate, the Reserve Bank opens its shop every Monday morning at 9 o'clock and buys all the foreign exchange and then issues Australian dollars. Those dollars just pumped up the money supply and added kerosene to inflation, right? In other words, you were burning your own inflation rate by the Reserve Bank keeping to a fixed exchange rate. And the other thing is the Treasury, this is Mr Stone et al., had the exchange rate too high to make imports cheaper. And they thought if they made imports cheaper, it would put downward pressure on local prices and that would hold wages down. So it was all wrong.
And right at the start, the government actually depreciated the dollar, didn't it?
10% the day after we were elected. There was a big capital outflow before we arrived in office, and we tried to put a suture on that by reducing by 10% the value of the dollar administratively.
So the money was flowing out of Australia, and presumably that was partly a kind of knee-jerk reaction to a Labor government.
Yeah, that's right. So we validated that shift and brought it down to 10. But within 6 months it had come back to where we had brought it down. It was 94 or 5 cents US, and within 6 months we were back to 91 or 92.
We'll come to the detail of the float in a minute, but why did that put you onto a road from which there was no turning back?
Well, for a number of reasons. We knew the exchange rate was hugely overvalued, at least by 25%. What we had to do was turn what's called a nominal depreciation of the exchange rate, like the rate drops 25%, but we had to hang on to the competitiveness by stopping import prices rising and then that being collected in wages, right? So in other words, on 1 minute you get 25% more competitive and a minute later you lose it. So we had to turn a nominal depreciation of the exchange rate into a real depreciation, real. That meant a reduction in real wages. In other words, to maintain the competitiveness via the new, more competitive exchange rate, we couldn't let the price surge go into wages. And that meant the Accord had to put its hand up for a shift in the exchange rate's competitiveness to real wages, which it did.
From the outset, Treasury head John Stone was strongly opposed to the float. Did his arguments influence you at all, and how tough was it to run against him in opposition?
They didn't influence me at all because, you see, in what was in the managed system, which was set every Monday morning by the Secretary of the Treasury, the Reserve Bank Governor, the Secretary of the Finance and the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, it was set by 4 officials. The exchange rate was set every Monday morning by 4 officials. And it used to move, it's called a crawling peg system, it used to move by little amounts. Once the market's got you and they've shoved you down 10%, it's all over. You can't, it was like the George Soros bet on the English pound in 1979. Once the hedge funds start shorting the dollar and they forced you into a big discretionary depreciation, you're kidding yourself thinking you can then sit there every Monday morning doing little adjustments. So Bob Johnson, the governor, said to me the day after we did this, of course, Treasury, you know, this system, the crawling peg systems had it. They've got our number. And because that was so obviously true, that all the stuff John Stone said later just cut no ice with me.
You had to manage both the Reserve Bank and your own department through that process, and there was deep disagreement between them. Deep disagreement between Bob Johnson and John Stone. Bob Johnson, the Reserve Bank Governor, John Stone, the head of your Treasury.
Yeah.
How hard was that to manage, and how did you go about
Well,
it?
you've got to remember, Kerry, in those days, the Reserve Bank was simply a bond-selling agency of the Treasury. It had no great policy standing. You see, because the exchange rate was fixed by the officials and interest rates were fixed in a band around the cabinet table on recommendations from the Treasurer and the Treasury. So what did the Reserve Bank have to do? It had to run the interest rates during the week in the band and muck around with the exchange rate to keep it around the rate that had been fixed by the Committee of Four. So
the Reserve Bank was subordinate to Treasury.
Completely subordinate, and the Treasury looked down its nose at the Reserve Bank, and you'd notice this in meetings. Whenever the Governor or the Deputy Governor or the Vice Governor turned up, they were always very careful about what they'd say, while the Treasury Secretary and Deputy Secretaries were present, because the superior department had the policy, call the policy shots. So here they have a treasurer who's listening to them around an obvious potential change, yet they don't have the sort of bureaucratic confidence to knock the Treasury over.
So in that relationship that you were establishing month by month with Bob Johnson at the Reserve Bank,
Yeah.
while you're managing the Treasury relationship over here, how influential was Bob Johnson on you with regard to the whole issue of the float?
Oh, very. Oh, Bob Johnson was just a fantastic character. Fantastic character. He was the secretary of the Campbell Committee. He's the guy that actually wrote the Campbell report.
This was the committee established by Malcolm Fraser to establish the whole financial system.
The open framework.
Yes.
The open framework. So he had the stuff in his head. And he'd always have this sort of world-weary sort of composure. Oh, well, you know, we've all seen this before, Treasurer. But the fact is, his storyline always had integrity to it and was true. So I essentially bought his view that the existing exchange rate system was finished, had it. But we would have some time before the markets came back to us again, right? We'd given the hedgies a win by dropping down 10% on day one. It would take some months before they came, so we had some time.
So what does it say that the Reserve Bank Governor would use a term like war book to describe the blueprint that he was developing when you said to him, go ahead and take a formal look at this for a transition to the float?
Yeah, I said to him about...
Why a war book?
Well, because all the banks close their positions in foreign exchange every afternoon at 5 o'clock with the Reserve Bank. I mean, there was exchange controls. If you were a private company, if you were say one of Australia's international companies like a BHP or a REA, you couldn't put money offshore without a clerk in the Reserve Bank ticked it, right? So it was a completely oppressive regime. So to break it open required a lot to do. So about May or June, Bob Johnson came for the monthly debrief to talk to me. Said, well, of course, Treasury, you know, we're living in a sort of la-la land. At the moment, the markets haven't come back, but they will. And we've got to think about what we do when they do. I said, well, Bob, what we need, Bob, is a kind of Gregory's. You know, Gregory's was the road maps of Sydney, the Gregory's. We need a kind of Gregory's, a road map, where we'd go. And he said, you mean a war book? And I said, well, a war book. Okay, a war book. He said, yeah. Well, that's the thing. There is no literature on this. He said, you know, it's a seat of the pants job, Treasury. There's no literature on this. So let's try and get a bit of literature into place. But of course, that was an arrangement with him and me, not the Treasury.
So was John Stone aware of these conversations you were having with Bob Johnson?
Only vaguely. Only vaguely.
Now, so that means you were deliberately shutting him out
of
that road that you were embarking on with Bob Johnson?
Whatever debrief document I got from the Governor, they got. But I wouldn't let him into the conversations. I never invited John in for any conversations I had with Bob Johnson on the monthly debrief.
Why?
Because the bank spoke to me. That was under the Reserve Bank Act. the Treasurer and the Board are bound to agree or endeavour to agree. So therefore I was owed a debriefing, and I wanted to be on top of the economic heap, not below it. So I kept John over at the Treasury building and I ran my discussion with Bob Johnson.
But knowing at the same time that John Stone was implacably opposed to what you were discussing with Bob Johnson.
The opposition was pointless because the system, we'd been found out in the first appreciation.
So at what point would you say that it was abundantly clear and you accepted that there had to be a float at some time?
I'd say May, June. I've shown you a document before this interview where Bob Johnson's writing to me in July talking about a movement to a quantity-based system, and he mentions the war book. You know, so that's July.
The broader public probably couldn't care two hoots about who pushed hardest for the float or who said what first. But it is a source of deep disagreement between you and Bob Hawke.
No, it is a source now. It wasn't then. And it wasn't until I defeated Bob for the leadership. See, before I defeated Bob for the Prime Ministership, you've never heard any debate about the float. This came in the so-called book he wrote, The Hawke Years, which is just broadly a piece of fiction written to his account, in where he's by that stage recognised how important the float is, and thank you, he'll dress himself in the float coat.
You're not telling me that it took him until after he was out of office and he was writing a memoir or an autobiography to suddenly realise how important that float was?
No, I'm not telling you that. Of course he knew how important, but what I am telling you is it took him that long to make these claims.
So how closely were you talking with Bob Hawke about the float
All the
as
time.
you were conducting this conversation with Bob Johnson?
Completely, Bob was completely kept in the loop from
Bob
May,
Hawke was completely kept in the loop.
Bob Hawke from May, June, July, August. Bob was fine with the float.
He was
Completely
always
fine.
on board with the float.
Always on board, yep.
So it's really just, I guess, remains a point of disagreement as to his version of yours.
Well, look, there's a couple of documents worth. I mean, we are going around the file, so let's at least put some of this nonsense to bed. On 4 April 83, 4 weeks after I become Treasurer, I do an interview with Ross Gittins, where I say in the Sydney Morning Herald that I'm going to set up a new committee to revise the Campbell recommendations around financial deregulation. You can't have flexible financial markets and a rigid exchange rate. It was really telling him we're heading for a float. I mean, you couldn't be explicit, but it was there, and of course I set it up. That was 4 weeks after I become Treasurer, right? And the financial markets didn't come at us until September, but Ted Evans, the Secretary of the head of General Financial Policy in the Treasury, writes to John Stone in saying, on Sunday, 23 October, the Treasurer rang me at home, noting his concern with the way monetary growth had been proceeding and referring to discussions the Treasury had had with the Reserve Bank about the float. When we met with the Treasurer that night, he asked for the views of each of us present at the Treasury on the proposal to float the A dollar, to which he was inclined, to which the Treasurer was inclined. Now this is October. This is October 23.
And
right?
this was an exchange between Ted Evans, a senior Treasury official, and John Stone, the head of Treasury, talking about a conversation you had with him, where you, in September, you're saying supporting the float.
Because you see, the markets didn't bring the rate back to 91 or 2 cents until September. From March to September, there is no pressure on us. It only comes back in September.
So in very broad terms, Bob Hawke told the ABC series Labor in Power the initiative for the float of the dollar came from within my office, said
that
Hawke.
is completely...
Paul Keating had to be brought along.
A complete lie. A complete lie. Look, here's a cabinet submission I brought to the cabinet, a cabinet submission, a cabinet memorandum dated 2 November. Mr Keating wrote, beyond these essentially technical changes lies the possibility of a floating exchange rate with a quantity as distinct from a price intervention in system. This is an option we may wish to or be forced to consider at some future time, but it would represent a quantum leap from the existing price intervention system. I will keep under review the effectiveness of the exchange rate system until new arrangements are in place. The alternative is direct controls of some sort, but this is an approach I do not favour. In other words, I'm saying to the Cabinet, I don't favour direct controls as the Treasury favours them. We're basically going to a float, but I'll keep you informed, right?
The Bob Hawke view isn't just reinforced by his own supporters. One of your own hand-picked economic advisors, Barry Hughes, also told Labor in Power that while you were in front of the cart on many other things, like banking reform, that, quote, I think Paul Keating was certainly not in the vanguard on this, he was pulled along.
Yeah, well, Barry was part of the amateur hour with Ross Garnaut. I mean, I've got the black cobra sitting in the Treasury, ready to spit venom at us over the exchange rate, that's Stone, right? And I've got the amateur hour in the staffing in Parliament House, you know. And I've
That's not very respectful of a man that you handpicked
well,
for the job.
Yeah, but this is what in the end.
I mean, he's still quite a respected economist
Yeah, I know.
today.
But when it comes to the big decisions, you get paid on the decisions you take. I've got these financial markets ready to pour a ton of money into the place, of which the Reserve Bank had to buy all the currency. See, so the most important person here was another staffer in my office, the secretary, my private secretary, who later became secretary to the Treasury, and at the time of these remarks was chairman of the Industry Commission, Tony Cole, right? He says this about the float in a document in his own handwriting, which I've shown you and I have on the table. I think it is fair to say, and he wrote this on 1 May 1990, I think it's fair to say that both the Treasurer and the Prime Minister had decided a float was on prior to October 28. From then on, it was only a matter of when the circumstances were right.
There was a view, as you know, that that essentially you were too much in the control of Treasury, in that John Stone was rigid on not wanting a float, and that's why it took you so long to come on board. I think Bob Hawke said that that there was the sense that you wanted to float, but that John Stone was holding you by the feet. You were trying to kick free,
That's
but
all
you just
nonsense.
couldn't.
That's all nonsense. Bob and I had agreed on a float months before. The markets had not come back to us to about 91 cents till September. In the end, we floated on the 8th of December. So you're arguing here about 8 weeks or 7 or 8 weeks. That's it. Between March and September 93, there is no pressure in money terms to float. The big amounts of money start in September, October. That's why I called the Treasury meeting on the Sunday night in October, because I was worried about the capital inflow and what it was doing to the money supply. So there was no issue then. We were always floating. It was only a matter of the timing. By the way, just worth making the point, I did the press conference for the float. If Bob Hawke had been the true progenitor of the float, as he alleges later, and it was the most important thing since sliced bread, he would have done the press conference. But I did the press conference with Bob Johnson, right? And the reason I did is because Bob Johnson was the bureaucratic progenitor of the float, and I was the political progenitor of the float.
Now, why wasn't John Stone there as head of Treasury at that press conference?
Well, he said to me, do I come Treasurer? I said, no, John, I can't have you there. You're opposed to it. You'll get asked about it. You will accurately reflect your views, and your views have been overridden now by the Cabinet, so I can't have you there. And of course, for Bob Johnson, Bob was kind of embarrassed that all of a sudden he's sitting with the Treasurer and no Treasury Secretary. This is the first time the Reserve Bank looked like a true Reserve Bank ever.
Did John Stone accept that with good grace?
He accepted it. I can't say whether it was with good grace. He didn't like it, of course. He didn't like the whole thing, but nominally he accepted it and stood back, and I did the press conference with Bob Johnson.
Was this also the point at which the Reserve Bank began to be more independent of Treasury, and if so, how significant was that?
Oh, massively significant, because all of a sudden the gang of four that met Monday morning to decide the exchange rate never had a role any longer. You know, never had a role any longer. And the interest rate band and the management band for the exchange rate was no longer operative, and exchange controls went as well. That's the other thing. John Stone opposed, even though the Cabinet had actually agreed to go for the float, he wanted to keep exchange controls. I wouldn't have a bar of it. They went too. So the Reserve Bank, for the first time ever, starts to look like what we now recognise as the Reserve Bank of Australia.